There is something quietly strange about the way modern humans sleep. We lie down alone, or nearly alone, in a dark and silent room, on a soft and carefully engineered surface, and we expect our bodies to fall unconscious for 8 uninterrupted hours, and then wake feeling restored. We have built entire industries around this idea. We have designed mattresses and pillows and blackout curtains and white noise machines and sleep tracking devices that count our hours and grade our performance. We have written books about how to sleep better, how to fall asleep faster, how to stop waking in the middle of the night. We treat interrupted sleep as a medical problem. We treat the inability to fall asleep as a disorder. We measure the quality of our rest the way we might measure the output of a machine. And yet, for most of human history, no one slept this way. That raises a quiet question. If the 8-hour block of uninterrupted nighttime sleep is so natural, so deeply biological, so fundamental to human health, why does almost no human being, throughout the vast majority of our evolutionary history, actually sleep that way? To answer that question, we have to go back. Not just a few centuries, not just to the ancient world of Greece or Rome or Mesopotamia. We have to go back much further than that. We have to go back to the long and almost unimaginably quiet era, before agriculture, before cities, written language, before any of these structures that define what we call civilization. We have to go back to the world in which the human body was actually shaped, because it is only in that world, in that slow and ancient and profoundly different environment, that the biology of human sleep begins to make sense. The human species, in its current anatomical form, has existed for somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years. That is a number so large it's difficult to feel. If you tried to count to 200,000, one number per second, it would take you more than 2 days without stopping. And for nearly all of that time, for the overwhelming majority of that vast expanse of human existence, our ancestors did not sleep the way we sleep today. They did not have bedrooms. They did not have mattresses. They did not have alarm clocks or sleep schedules, or a culturally agreed upon hour at which it was appropriate to go to bed. They slept in ways that were shaped entirely by the pressures of the environment around them, and those pressures were very different from anything most people in the modern world have ever experienced. To understand ancient human sleep, we first have to understand something about the world in which our ancestors lived. For most of our evolutionary history, human beings were hunter-gatherers. This is not simply a description of an economic system or a food acquisition strategy. It is a description of an entire way of being in the world. Hunter-gatherers lived in small groups, typically ranging from perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, though the exact composition of these groups shifted constantly as people came together and separated based on the availability of resources, the season, the demand of the environment. They moved through landscapes that were alive with both danger and abundance. They knew their territory intimately, the way you might know the rooms of your own home, understanding which plants grew where, which animals moved through which corridors, which sources of water could be trusted and which could not. In this world, sleep was never a private act. It was always a communal one. Human beings in ancient environments did not retreat to individual rooms and closed doors behind them. They slept together, in groups, their bodies close enough to share warmth, their sleeping arrangements shaped by the social bonds that held the group together and the practical necessities of survival. The old, the young, the sick, and the healthy all slept in proximity to one another. Children slept pressed against adults. Adults slept near the fire. The fire itself was a central organising feature of ancient sleep, and its importance cannot be overstated. From an evolutionary perspective, fire was one of the most transformative developments in the long history of our lineage. The evidence suggests that human ancestors were controlling fire at least 1 million years ago, and possibly much earlier than that. Fire provided warmth, of course, and it provided light, and it provided the ability to cook food, which had its own profound effects on human biology and development. But fire also provided something else. It provided protection. In the ancient African environments where much of our evolution took place, the night was not a safe or quiet time. Predators moved through the darkness. Lions and leopards and hyenas and other large carnivores were active after sunset, and a sleeping human being was a vulnerable one. The fire created a zone of relative safety. It kept the darkness at a distance. It made the night slightly less dangerous than it would otherwise have been. And so, ancient humans slept near the fire. They arranged themselves around it. The fire determined where they lay, and the fire shaped the rhythms of their night. This matters because fire does not burn at a constant, predictable rate. It flares and dims. It needs tending. Someone needs to add wood to adjust the arrangement of burning branches to keep the flames alive through the long hours of darkness. And this reality, the reality of a fire that needed watching and maintaining, meant that ancient human sleep was never meant to be uninterrupted. Someone was always meant to be awake, or at least lighter in their sleep, ready to respond to the fire, or to a sound in the darkness, or to any of the other countless signals that an ancient environment might send. This raises an important question. If ancient humans were sleeping in communal groups near fires that needed tending, in environments where predators were active at night, how did they actually structure their sleep? What did their nights actually look like? And the answer, supported by a remarkable body of modern research and by observations of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies that have maintained traditional ways of life, is that they almost certainly did not sleep in a single, consolidated block. They slept in fragments. They slept in what researchers now call biphasic or polyphasic patterns. They fell asleep and woke and dozed and woke again. And this pattern of fragmented, socially embedded, environmentally responsive sleep was not a disorder. It was the design. The idea of biphasic sleep, the idea that human beings are naturally inclined to sleep in two separate periods rather than one continuous block, is not new. Historians and scholars who examined pre-industrial European records have noted that references to a first sleep and a second sleep appear with striking regularity in documents from the medieval period and earlier. People would go to bed after dark, sleep for several hours, wake in the middle of the night for a period of calm wakefulness, and then return to sleep until morning. This middle-of-the-night waking period was not treated as a problem. It was treated as a normal part of the night. People used it to pray, to think, to talk quietly with a partner, to tend to the fire, to visit neighbours, or simply to lie in a quiet state of reflection before drifting back to sleep. The historian Roger E. Kirsch spent more than a decade researching pre-industrial sleep patterns, and his findings were remarkable. He collected evidence from court records, from diaries, from medical texts, from literary works, from prayer books, all pointing in the same direction. Before the widespread adoption of artificial lighting, before the Industrial Revolution reshaped the rhythms of daily life, humans across many different cultures regularly experienced a segmented pattern of sleep. a first sleep followed by a waking interval followed by a second sleep. The waking interval was not accidental. It was expected. It was built into the cultural understanding of what a night was supposed to look like. If we look deeper into the biology of human sleep, we find something that supports this historical and anthropological picture. The human body is not a machine that runs on a fixed schedule. It is a biological system shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressure, and that system contains within it certain natural rhythms and tendencies that reveal something important about how we were meant to sleep. One of the most significant of these tendencies is what sleep researchers call the first night effect, the well-documented observation that when people sleep in an unfamiliar environment, one hemisphere of the brain remains more alert than the other. This asymmetric sleep, this half-wakefulness, is common in many other animal species, particularly those that face predation pressure. It is a survival mechanism. It allows the sleeper to respond quickly to threat, even while resting. And the fact that it persists in modern humans, even in environments of complete safety, suggests that it is a deeply embedded feature of our biology rather than a learned behaviour. The architecture of human sleep, the way a night of sleep is structured at the level of brain activity and physiology, also tells an interesting story. When researchers use electroencephalography to monitor brain activity during sleep, they observe a predictable pattern of cycles, each lasting roughly 90 minutes, moving through different stages of lighter and deeper sleep. What is notable about this architecture is that the period of lightest sleep, the periods when waking would be easiest and most natural, tend to occur at intervals that correspond roughly to the natural segmentation of a night. The body seems to build in transition points, moments of near wakefulness, that would in a more natural environment create opportunities to check on the surroundings, to tend to the fire, to respond to the sounds and signals of the night. In early human environments, this architecture made perfect sense. A sleeper who cycled through deep sleep and then rose briefly toward wakefulness had an opportunity to assess the situation, to confirm that the fire was still burning and that no predator had approached and that the other members of the group were still present and safe, before sinking back into deeper rest. This cycling, this rising and falling through the levels of sleep was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. It was the system working exactly as it was designed to work. From an evolutionary perspective, the pressures that shaped human sleep were multiple and complex. Predation was one pressure, but it was not the only one. Temperature was another. In many of the environments where our ancestors lived, the night brought a significant drop in temperature, and maintaining body warmth through the night required either adequate shelter and bedding, or proximity to other warm bodies, or both. The act of sleeping in a group was itself a thermal strategy, a way of sharing and conserving the warmth that individual bodies generate. When you sleep pressed against another person, you sleep warmer. When you sleep in a cluster of bodies, the group as a whole retains heat more effectively than any individual could alone. This is not sentiment, it is thermodynamics. The social structure of ancient human groups also shaped sleep in ways that we rarely think about today. In a hunter-gatherer band, the relationships between individuals were complex and continuously negotiated. Who slept where, who slept near whom, who was positioned closest to the fire, and who was positioned at the edge of the sleeping group. These were not trivial decisions. They reflected and reinforced the social hierarchy of the group, the bonds of kinship and partnership, the distribution of trust and vulnerability. The person who slept at the outer edge of the group was more exposed to the cold and to potential predators. The person who slept near the centre, near the fire, was more protected. And these positions were not randomly assigned. They reflected the social reality of the group. Children in ancient human societies slept differently from how children sleep today, and this difference is more significant than it might initially appear. In contemporary Western societies, we have developed a set of cultural norms around infant and child sleep that emphasize independence and separation. We put babies in separate cribs, in separate rooms, and we train them toward consolidated nighttime sleep from very early in life. We treat co-sleeping, the practice of parents and children sharing a sleep surface, as something usual or even risky, despite the fact that it is the norm in the majority of the world's cultures both today and throughout human history. The anthropological record is very clear on this point. In hunter-gatherer societies, infants and young children sleep in continuous physical contact with their caregivers. They are carried during the day and they sleep alongside adults at night. This is not a cultural preference. It is a biological expectation. The infant human body is designed to be in contact with a warm and responsive caregiver during sleep. The physiology of infant sleep, including heart rate regulation, breathing patterns, temperature maintenance, and arousal responses, functions differently and in many ways more effectively in the context of co-sleeping than in isolation. The frequent night wakings that parents of young infants often experience as exhausting and disruptive are in many ways a reflection of infant biology functioning as it was designed to function in an environment of close physical contact and responsive caregiving, rather than the isolated crib environment that modern Western culture has created. If we look deeper into the anthropology of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, we find that the picture of ancient sleep that emerges is rich and textured. Researchers who have studied the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the few remaining populations that maintain a largely traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle, have found sleep patterns that are strikingly different from the consolidated 8-hour model that modern sleep medicine holds up as the standard. The Hadza on average sleep for less than 7 hours per night, and their sleep is much more variable and fragmented than modern sleep recommendations would suggest. They do not maintain fixed bedtimes, they do not maintain fixed wake times. Their sleep is responsive to the social environment, to the temperature, to the light, and to the many other signals that the natural environment provides. What is perhaps most striking about Hadza sleep data is not the duration of their sleep, but the pattern of alertness within the group at any given time during the night. Because different individuals have different chronotypes, because some people are naturally inclined toward earlier sleep and wakefulness, and others toward later, and because these variations are at least partly heritable, a group of individuals sleeping together will rarely all be in their deepest sleep simultaneously. At almost any point during the night, at least one or two members of the group will be in a lighter stage of sleep, or will be briefly awake. The researchers who analysed this data calculated that there were only about 80 minutes in a typical night when all members of a study group were in deep sleep simultaneously. This is a remarkable finding. It suggests that within a sleeping group of even modest size, there is almost always someone who is relatively alert, someone who is positioned to notice a threat or respond to a change in the environment. The variation in individual chronotypes The variation that we often experience in modern life as a source of conflict between night owls and early birds turns out to have a plausible evolutionary function at the group level. A group of individuals with diverse chronotypes is a group that maintains a more continuous watch over the night than a group of individuals who all sleep and wake at exactly the same time. The diversity is the protection. In early human environments, the night was not uniform. It changed hour by hour in ways that are difficult for people living in artificially lit and climate-controlled spaces to fully appreciate. In the early hours after sunset, the night was at its warmest, and the risk of predation, while real, was somewhat lower than it would become in the deep hours before dawn. As the night progressed and temperatures dropped, the need for warmth became more acute. In the coldest hours of the night, typically in the several hours before dawn, the body's core temperature reaches its lowest point, and the risk of hypothermia, while usually not severe in temperate climates, was a real consideration in many of the environments our ancestors inhabited. And then, as dawn approached, the light began to change in subtle ways that the human visual system is remarkably sensitive to, and the transition from deep night to early morning brought its own changes in the activity patterns of both prey and predators. A human being whose sleep was perfectly consolidated, who fell unconscious at sunset and woke only at dawn, would be less capable of responding to these gradual changes in the night environment than one whose sleep was more fragmented and responsive. The person who woke briefly in the middle of the night, who lay quietly for a time, noting the temperature and the sounds and the condition of the fire, and then returned to sleep, was in a better position to respond to anything the night might bring. This fragmented wakefulness was not a failure of sleep, it was a feature of sleep. There is another dimension of ancient sleep that we rarely consider in modern discussions of sleep health, and that is the dimension of dreaming. From an evolutionary perspective, dreams are one of the most puzzling features of human sleep. They consume metabolic resources. They involve complex and often vivid mental activity. They sometimes wake us from our deepest rest. And yet, they have persisted across the entirety of human evolution, which suggests that whatever function they serve, it is important enough to justify the cost. Researchers have proposed many theories about the function of dreaming, from emotional processing to memory consolidation to threat rehearsal to creative problem solving, and the evidence supports several of these functions to varying degrees. What is interesting from the perspective of ancient sleep is that the periods of sleep most associated with vivid dreaming, the rapid eye movement stages of sleep, tend to occur in greater proportion toward the end of a sleep period. In a consolidated 8-hour sleep, the richest and most vivid dreaming typically occurs in the final 2 hours before waking. In a biphasic sleep pattern, with a waking interval in the middle of the night and a second sleep before dawn, the second sleep period is likely to be particularly rich in rapid eye movement sleep. The ancient practice of waking in the middle of the night and then returning to sleep may have, among other things, created conditions for particularly intense and memorable dreaming in the second sleep. Some researchers have speculated that this may be one reason why dreams and dream interpretation have played such significant roles in the spiritual and ritual life of many ancient cultures. The dreams that occurred in second sleep, after a quiet period of wakefulness and reflection, may have been especially vivid and emotionally resonant. The transition from hunter-gatherer life to agricultural life, which began roughly 10,000 years ago in several parts of the world and spread gradually over subsequent millennia, changed many things about the way human beings lived. It changed what they ate and where they lived, how they organised their social relationships, and what kinds of work they did with their days. And it also changed gradually and significantly the way they slept. Agricultural life introduced new pressures as new structures that shaped sleep in ways that moved it progressively further from the ancient pattern. Farmers, unlike hunter-gatherers, were bound to specific pieces of land. They could not follow the rhythms of animal migration or plant abundance the way hunter-gatherers could. They were committed to staying in one place through the seasons, which meant that they had to store food, manage resources, and maintain complex relationships with neighbours who were making the same commitment to the same landscape. Agricultural communities were generally larger than hunter-gatherer bands, and the increased population density of farming villages created new social dynamics and new pressures on the organisation of daily life, including the organisation of sleep. In early agricultural societies, the rhythms of work were shaped by the seasons and by the demands of crops and animals. Planting and harvest required long and physically demanding days. The care of domestic animals created obligations that extended through the night in some seasons, and the growing complexity of social organisation meant that the night became a time not just for rest, but for a range of social, spiritual and practical activities. Archaeological evidence from early farming settlements shows that these communities maintained fires for warmth and light, and the organisation of sleeping spaces within early agricultural structures suggests that communal sleeping remained common even as the architecture of human habitation became more elaborate. If we look deeper into the historical record of sleep across different cultures and periods, we find an enormous diversity of sleeping practices that defies any simple generalization. In ancient Egypt, the wealthy slept on raised beds made of wood and woven materials, while the poor slept on reed mats on the floor. In ancient China, ceramic pillows were common, hard and shaped to support the neck without allowing the head to sink. In ancient Japan, sleeping on the floor on woven mats was and remains the norm for much of the population. In many parts of Africa and the Americas and Asia, hammocks made from plant fibres or animal skins provided a suspended sleeping surface that kept the sleeper off the ground and away from insects and other ground-dwelling creatures. What is striking about this diversity is not the variation in sleeping surfaces or positions, but rather the common thread that runs through nearly all of these pre-industrial sleeping practices, which is the communal nature of sleep. Across cultures and across history, human beings slept together. They slept in households that included multiple generations, multiple family members, sometimes servants or workers or guests. The idea of a sleeping space designed for a single individual, or even for a couple in isolation from the rest of the household, is a remarkably recent cultural development, and one that is still far from universal. The transformation of sleep from a communal and fragmented experience to a privatized and consolidated one is a story that unfolds most dramatically in the context of the Industrial Revolution. The changes that industrialization brought to human life in the 18th and 19th centuries were so rapid and so thorough that they reshaped nearly every aspect of daily existence, including the most fundamental biological rhythms. Before industrialization, the primary source of light after sunset was fire, in the form of candles, oil lamps, and hearth fires. These light sources were expensive, both in terms of the materials they consumed and the labour required to maintain them. Most people could not afford to light their homes brightly after dark for extended periods, and so darkness, real and pervasive darkness, governed the hours after sunset for most people throughout most of human history. Darkness is not merely the absence of light, it is a biological signal. The human body contains a sophisticated system for tracking the cycle of light and dark, centered on a tiny region of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which serves as the body's master clock. This internal clock is synchronized to the external world primarily through light, and specifically through the blue wavelength light that is characteristic of daylight. When blue light enters the eye, it suppresses the production of melatonin, the hormone that promotes sleepiness. When blue light is absent, as it is after sunset, melatonin production rises, and the body begins its transition towards sleep. This system worked remarkably well for most of human evolutionary history because the light environment of the natural world provided a very clear and consistent signal. The sun rose and set at predictable times. Twilight, with its shifting spectrum of light, provided a gradual transition. Firelight, while warm and comforting, has very little blue wavelength content, and therefore has a minimal effect on melatonin suppression. Our ancestors could sit by the fire in the evening, and their bodies would still be receiving the biological message that darkness had come, and it was time to transition towards sleep. The invention of gaslighting in the early 19th century, and then electric lighting later in that century and into the 20th, changed this biological equation profoundly. Suddenly, human beings could extend the light of day far into the night. They could illuminate their homes and streets and workplaces with light bright enough to read by, to work by, to socialize by. And much of this artificial light contained the blue wavelength frequencies that the human circadian system interprets as daylight. The effect on sleep was gradual but significant. As artificial lighting became more widespread and more affordable, people began to stay up later. The natural transition towards sleep that darkness had always triggered was delayed by the persistent brightness of artificial light, and as bedtime shifted later, sleep became compressed, squeezed between the late evenings of a culture that no longer needed to honour darkness and the early mornings demanded by the schedules of industrial work. This compression of sleep happened alongside another major change, which was the privatization of sleep. As standards of living rose through the 19th and 20th centuries, and as housing became more specialized in its organization, the communal sleeping arrangements that had characterized most of human history were progressively replaced by private sleeping spaces. Bedrooms became individual rooms assigned to specific people. Beds became owned by individuals or couples. The ancient pattern of sleeping in a group of 20 or 30 people, of being surrounded by the breathing and warmth and quiet sounds of other human bodies through the night, was replaced by a new ideal of privacy and silence and isolation. The bedroom became a sanctuary, a private space, a room of one's own. This privatization of sleep was in many ways presented as progress, as a scene of prosperity and civilization, and in some respects it brought real improvements. Private sleeping spaces offered protection from disease transmission, which in the crowded and often unsanitary conditions of pre-modern communal life was a genuine concern. They offered a degree of quiet and darkness that was difficult to achieve in communal sleeping. They offered privacy for the intimate activities of partnership, but they also came with costs that were less visible and less acknowledged. The isolation of sleep removed the social scaffolding that had supported human rest for hundreds of thousands of years. The communal warmth, the sense of safety provided by the proximity of others, the subtle biological regulation that comes from sleeping near other bodies, All of these things were lost when sleep became a private and individual experience. From an evolutionary perspective, the human body is not well designed for sleeping alone. The biology of human attachment, the system of hormones and neural circuits that governs our emotional bonds with other people, is deeply intertwined with the biology of sleep. The hormone oxytocin, which plays a central role in social bonding and attachment, is influenced by physical closeness and touch, and its effects include a calming of the nervous system that facilitates sleep. When we sleep near people we trust, when we feel the warmth of another body and hear the rhythm of another person's breathing, our nervous systems respond with signals of safety that promote deeper and more restorative rest. When we sleep alone, particularly in conditions of stress or anxiety, the nervous system remains more alert, more watchful, more ready to respond to threat. This is not a psychological weakness. It is ancient biology. The implications of this biological reality are significant and often overlooked in modern sleep medicine. Much of the advice and treatment that modern sleep medicine offers is directed at helping individuals sleep better in isolation, in private bedrooms, in conditions of silence and darkness. Sleep hygiene recommendations emphasize keeping the bedroom quiet, dark, and cool. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia works to reduce the racing thoughts and anxious watchfulness that prevent sleep. Medications suppress the nervous system's arousal. All of these interventions are addressing real problems, but they are addressing problems that arise at least in part from the conditions we have created. We have designed a sleeping environment that runs counter to the evolutionary expectations of the human body, and then we are working to fix the biological distress that this mismatch creates. The anthropological evidence on this point is particularly striking. Studies of sleep in cultures where co-sleeping is the norm, where children sleep with parents and family members sleep in close proximity through adulthood, consistently find lower rates of insomnia and sleep-related anxiety than studies conducted in Western cultures where private sleeping is the ideal. The midnight wakefulness, the racing thoughts, the inability to fall back asleep after waking in the night, these are predominantly complaints of people who sleep alone or in the kind of semi-isolation that characterizes modern Western bedrooms. People who sleep in genuinely communal contexts, who are surrounded by the sounds and warmth of other people, report less of this kind of distress. This does not mean that communal sleeping is without its own difficulties. Snoring and restlessness, and the varying sleep needs of different individuals can all create disruption in communal sleeping arrangements. The ancient human sleeping group was not a perfectly peaceful and harmonious arrangement, but it was an arrangement that the human body recognized and responded to as normal, and the disruptions it brought were disruptions that the human nervous system was equipped to handle. The isolation of modern, private sleeping, by contrast, is a condition that the human nervous system continues to treat as potentially threatening, even when the conscious mind knows perfectly well that there is nothing to fear. If we look deeper into the neuroscience of sleep, we find something important about the way the sleeping brain processes the social environment. The human brain, even during sleep, does not entirely shut down its monitoring of the social world. Research on sleeping communal environments has shown that the brain continues to process social signals during sleep, remaining somewhat more responsive to sounds that are socially meaningful, such as a familiar voice or the sound of a child crying, than to sounds of equal volume that carry no social significance. This selective responsiveness is a feature of the sleeping brain that makes perfect sense in the context of communal living. In a group of sleeping people, the ability to remain somewhat responsive to social signals while still resting deeply would allow individuals to maintain their position within the social fabric of the group, even through the night. The seasonal variation of sleep is another dimension of ancient sleep patterns that modern life has largely erased. In the natural world, the length of the night varies dramatically across the seasons. In high latitudes, summer nights are brief and winter nights are long. Even in tropical regions, there are seasonal variations in light and temperature that would have influenced the sleep patterns of our ancestors. The human circadian system is sensitive to these seasonal changes, and there is evidence that a body is naturally inclined towards somewhat longer sleep in winter and somewhat shorter sleep in summer, reflecting the longer and shorter nights of those seasons. Modern life, with its artificial lighting and climate control and fixed work schedules, has largely eliminated these seasonal variations in sleep. We sleep roughly the same amount year-round, in conditions of roughly similar temperature and light, and in doing so we disconnect ourselves from the ancient rhythms that shaped our biology. The relationship between sleep and the natural environment extends beyond the question of light. Temperature, humidity, the sounds of wind and rain and animals, the subtle variations in air quality that occur through the night, all of these environmental inputs are registered by the sleeping brain, and all of them have shaped the biology of human sleep over evolutionary time. When we seal ourselves in climate-controlled rooms and block out the sounds of the night with white noise machines and sleep in the same conditions regardless of the season or the weather, we create a sleeping environment that is in many ways more comfortable than anything our ancestors experienced, but also more disconnected from the natural world that shaped our biology. This is not an argument against comfortable sleeping conditions. The temperature regulation and protection from insects and weather that modern housing provides represent real and meaningful improvements in human welfare. But it is worth understanding that the comfort we have created is a departure from the ancient norm, and that the human body's expectations about sleep were formed in a world very different from the one most people in the modern world inhabit. When we struggle to sleep, when we lie awake in the quiet darkness of our private bedrooms, unable to silence our minds, we're in some sense experiencing the consequence of this mismatch between our ancient biology and our modern environment. The question of what to do with this understanding is not simple. We cannot and should not try to recreate the literal conditions of Paleolithic sleep. We cannot return to sleeping on the savannah in groups of 30 people around an open fire. But we can perhaps learn something from understanding where our biology comes from, something that might help us be more patient with ourselves when we wake in the night. More understanding of the fact that a brief period of wakefulness at 2 a.m. is not necessarily a sign that something is wrong. More open to the possibility that the anxiety we feel about our sleep may itself be contributing to our difficulty sleeping. The historian of sleep Matthew Wolff-Meyer, who spent time studying sleep in a Japanese community, noted something important about the cultural frameworks through which people interpret their sleep. In the community he studied, brief wakings during the night were treated as completely normal and unremarkable. People woke, lay quietly, perhaps shifted position or thought about something, and returned to sleep without anxiety. The waking was not medicalized. It was not interpreted as a symptom. It was simply part of the night. The contrast with the Western cultural framework in which waking in the night is often interpreted as a sign of insomnia or poor sleep quality, and therefore as a cause for concern, is striking. From an evolutionary perspective, the anxiety that many modern people feel about their sleep is itself deeply ironic. The vigilance that we bring to the monitoring of our sleep, the tracking apps and the sleep diaries and the careful measurement of hours and sleep stages is in some sense a manifestation of the same watchful awareness that helped our ancestors survive the night. But in the modern context, that watchfulness is directed not at the external environment, but at the internal experience of sleep itself, and it creates a feedback loop in which the anxiety about sleep interferes with the very sleep it is monitoring. Ancient humans did not worry about their sleep in this way. They could not. They had no framework for interpreting sleep as a performance to be optimized or a resource to be carefully managed. Sleep was simply what happened when darkness came and the body needed rest. If they woke in the night, they tended to the fire or checked on the children or simply lay in the quiet darkness of the sleeping group until sleep returned. The night was not an enemy to be conquered. It was simply part of the rhythm of existence. The role of light in regulating ancient sleep cannot be overstated. In a world without artificial lighting, the transition from day to night was a dramatic and unambiguous event. The sun set, the light faded, the temperature dropped, the sounds of the world changed as diurnal animals grew quiet and nocturnal ones became active. And all of these signals together told the human body in no uncertain terms that the day was over and the night had begun. The body's response to this cascade of environmental signals was the gradual onset of sleepiness, the rise of melatonin, the slowing of the heart rate, the drop in core temperature, all the physiological changes that prepare the body for sleep. In the modern world, this transition has been blurred and extended and in many cases eliminated. We can maintain the light of day indefinitely. We can eat and work and exercise at any hour. We can expose ourselves to the stimulating social signals of digital media late into the night. And the consequence of this blurring of the day-night boundary is that the body's natural transition towards sleep becomes confused and delayed. The melatonin that should begin rising at dusk may not rise until midnight or later. The gradual slowing of the physiological systems that prepare us for sleep is interrupted by the ongoing stimulation of artificial light and digital engagement. We reach for sleep in bodies that have not yet been given the biological signal that sleep is appropriate. The ancient practice of sitting around a fire in the evening hours, which might seem like a simple and practical way of staying warm and thus maintaining light, turns out to have been, among other things, a kind of biological preparation for sleep. The warm orange glow of firelight, with its minimal blue wavelength content, would have allowed the gradual rise of melatonin that signals the body toward rest, while still providing enough light for social interaction and practical activity. The social gathering around the fire in the evening hours, the talking and storytelling, quiet sharing of the day's experiences would have served as a gentle transition from the activity of the day to the rest of the night. And the gradual dimming of the fire as the night progressed, as the supply of fuel diminished and people began to sleep, would have deepened the darkness and the quiet that deepened sleep itself. We have largely lost this transition. We have replaced the campfire with the smartphone and the quiet storytelling of the evening with the relentless stimulation of digital media. And then we wonder why we cannot fall asleep, why we lie awake in the darkness after finally putting down our devices, why our minds continue to race with the energy of a world that seems unwilling to let us rest. If we consider what sleep meant in an ancient context, not just as a biological necessity, but as a social and spiritual experience, we begin to understand something that modern sleep medicine rarely addresses. Sleep in ancient human communities was not simply a matter of individual bodies shutting down for maintenance. It was a communal experience that reinforced the bonds of the group, that created shared time in the darkness, that connected the sleeping community to the rhythms of the natural world. The act of lying down together in the darkness, of listening to the sounds, of breathing around you, of feeling the warmth of other bodies near your own, was an act of profound trust and belonging. You were safe because others were near. You could rest because the group was watching. The spiritual significance of sleep in many ancient cultures reflects this deep social and biological reality. Dreams, which occur during sleep, were interpreted as messages, as communications from the spirit world, as prophecies and guidance. The threshold between waking and sleeping was understood as a permeable boundary, a place where the everyday world and the world of spirit came into contact. Sleep was not merely unconsciousness, it was a different mode of being, a different relationship with the world, that was valued and attended to in ways that modern secular culture rarely matches. The practice of dream interpretation, which appears in cultures across the world from the oldest recorded histories, suggests that the sleeping mind was understood to have access to something that the waking mind did not. In ancient Egypt, trained priests interpreted dreams for those seeking guidance. In ancient Greece, the sick would sleep in temple precincts hoping for healing dreams from the gods. In many indigenous cultures around the world, dream experiences are understood as genuinely informative, as ways of knowing that complement and sometimes exceed the knowledge available through waking awareness. This widespread cultural valuation of dream experience may reflect a genuine insight about the function of dreaming, that the sleeping mind processes information in ways that can produce insights and resolutions that the waking mind struggles to achieve. From an evolutionary perspective, the extended social and spiritual significance of sleep across human cultures is perhaps less surprising than it might initially appear. Sleep takes up roughly 1/3 of a human life. In an organism as socially complex and cognitively sophisticated as the human being, it would be strange if that 1/3 of life was simply blank time, mere biological maintenance with no social or psychological significance. The fact that humans across cultures and throughout history have consistently treated sleep as a meaningful and significant experience, as a time when important things happen, as a threshold that requires preparation or ritual, suggests that there is genuine wisdom in this orientation. The modern tendency to treat sleep purely as a biological function, to approach it as a performance metric and a health variable, strips away this dimension of significance. When we reduce sleep to a number of hours and a score on a sleep tracking app, we lose something that our ancestors maintained. We lose the sense that the night is a meaningful time, that what happens in the darkness matters, that the transition from waking to sleeping is worthy of attention and even reverence. This is not an argument for pre-scientific superstition. It is an argument for a richer understanding of sleep, one that takes seriously both the biological science of what happens during sleep and the long human tradition of treating sleep as something more than mere unconsciousness. The neuroscience of sleep has given us remarkable insights into the functions that sleep serves, We know far more than our ancestors did about the role of sleep in memory consolidation, in emotional regulation, in immune function, in metabolic health, in the clearance of cellular waste from the brain. These are real and important functions, but they do not exhaust the meaning of sleep. They do not fully account for why a third of human life is spent in this particular state of being, or why the experiences of that state have been so consistently significant to human beings across every culture and every era. The biological science of sleep and the cultural and philosophical traditions that have grown up around sleep are not in conflict. They are different perspectives on the same complex and profound phenomenon. And perhaps the most important thing that both perspectives share is the recognition that sleep matters, that it is not incidental or trivial, that it deserves to be taken seriously and treated with care. The modern sleep crisis, the epidemic of sleep deprivation and insomnia that affects a large proportion of people in industrialized societies, is in many ways a consequence of the accumulated departures from ancient sleep patterns that we've been examining. We have isolated our sleep, privatizing what was communal. We have consolidated it, compressing what was fragmented. We have disconnected it from the natural rhythms of light and dark that governed it for hundreds of thousands of years. We have surrounded it with anxiety, treating normal variations in sleep experience as symptoms of disorder. And we are paying a price for these departures in the form of chronic sleep insufficiency and its well-documented consequences for health and well-being. The path forward is not simple. We cannot simply reverse these departures. The social and economic and technological forces that have shaped modern sleep are not going to be wished away. But we can perhaps move toward a more nuanced and more historically informed understanding of what healthy sleep looks like. We can give ourselves permission to wake briefly in the night without treating it as a catastrophe. We can attend more carefully to the transition from waking to sleeping, creating conditions in the evening hours that support rather than undermine the body's natural movement toward rest. We can be more thoughtful about the role of light and darkness in regulating our biological rhythms. We can recognize that the need for social connection does not end at bedtime, and that the isolation of modern sleep comes with real costs. We can also perhaps recover something of the ancient attitude toward the night. Not the vulnerability or the danger, which we have rightly reduced, but the sense of the night as a meaningful time, as a time when something important happens, as a threshold that deserves to be approached with some degree of intention and care. The ritual of preparing for sleep, of quieting the mind and the body and the environment in the hours before lying down, is not merely a practical sleep hygiene measure. It is a recognition that the transition from waking to sleeping is significant, that it marks a genuine change in the nature of human experience, and that this change deserves to be honored rather than simply managed. The human body carries within it the memory of 100,000 years of sleeping in groups by firelight on the open savannah, of sleeping in the cold of winter packed close together for warmth, of sleeping lightly enough to hear the sounds of the night and respond to them, and deeply enough to restore the body and consolidate the learning of the day. This body we inhabit, with its complex sleep architecture and its sensitivity to light and social signals and temperature, is not a machine that was designed to be switched off for 8 hours every night in a dark and silent room. It is a living system that was shaped over an immense span of time by the pressures and conditions of the ancient world, and it retains the expectations and the tendencies that those conditions created. When we struggle with sleep, we are often struggling with the mismatch between what our biology expects and what our world provides. This mismatch is real, and it has real consequences. But understanding it, understanding where it comes from and why it exists, can perhaps help us approach it with more patience and more wisdom. We are not broken. We're ancient creatures in a modern world, trying to rest as our bodies have always rested, in a world that looks nothing like the one our bodies were designed for. And perhaps that understanding and quiet and calm and a little humbling is itself a kind of rest. To know that the waking in the night is old, that it belongs to us as much as our eyes and our hands, that it is part of what it means to be a human body in the darkness, is to release some of the anxiety that so often makes the night harder than it needs to be. The night is not your enemy. The darkness is not a problem to be solved. The quiet waking in the small hours is not a failure. It is the voice of something very old inside you, something that has been listening to the night for longer than civilization has existed, something that knows how to rest even when the world has forgotten what rest is supposed to look like. And so the night continues, as it always has. The darkness settles over the sleeping world. Somewhere, in the long memory of the human body, there is still the warmth of a fire, the sound of breathing, the quiet safety of belonging to a group of living creatures resting together in the ancient dark. That memory is not lost. It lives in the biology of every person who's ever struggled to sleep alone in a quiet room, wondering why rest feels so distant when it was, for so long, so simply and profoundly near. Let us return for a moment to the beginning of the story, to the very earliest chapter of human sleep, before language, before fire, before the social complexity that would come to define our species. Because there is something important to understand about the sleep of our most ancient ancestors, something that sets the context for everything that came after. Before human beings slept on the ground, they slept in the trees. This is not a metaphor or a philosophical observation. It is biological fact. The closest living relatives of human beings, the great apes, sleep primarily in nests that they construct in trees. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans all build sleeping structures from branches and leaves, elevated above the ground, each night. These nests are not permanent structures. They are built fresh most nights, representing a significant investment of time and energy that makes sense only as a response to the very real dangers of sleeping on the ground. The great apes, our closest cousins in the animal kingdom, evolved and persist in environments where the ground is genuinely dangerous after dark, and their sleeping behavior reflects this reality. The ancestors of modern humans descended from the trees, and this descent changed everything, including sleep. Sleeping on the ground, as opposed to in an elevated nest in a tree, is a much more dangerous proposition. A ground-sleeping primate is accessible to a much wider range of predators than an arboreal one. The shift to ground sleeping that occurred at some point in the human lineage required compensatory adaptations, and the most important of these adaptations was almost certainly the deepening of social sleeping. You cannot sleep safely on the ground alone, but you can sleep on the ground in a group, with fire, with social vigilance, with the communal watchfulness that only a highly social species can provide. From an evolutionary perspective, this is the origin story of human sleep. We came down from the trees and we learned to sleep together on the ground, and in doing so we transformed sleep from a solitary and elevated refuge into a social and terrestrial experience that required and reinforced the deep social bonds that are one of the most distinctive features of our species, The human capacity for social connection, for empathy, for collective action, for the extraordinary cooperation that has allowed our species to accomplish things no other animal has ever approached, is inseparable from the experience of sleeping together through the night. We are a species that learned safety in numbers, and we learned it in the darkness. This is perhaps the deepest reason why the isolation of modern sleep feels, at some bacteriological level, unsettling. When we sleep alone, we are doing something that our evolutionary history has very little preparation for. The great apes sleep in constructed nests, elevated above predators. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors slept in groups on the ground, protected by social vigilance and fire. Modern humans sleep in individual beds in private rooms, and the nervous system that was shaped by millions of years of either arboreal or communal sleeping does not have a deep template for this kind of isolation. It manages, it adapts, but it does not fully relax in the way that it was designed to relax in the presence of trusted others. The physiology of human sleep stages provides further evidence for this interpretation. Sleep researchers have identified several distinct stages of sleep, broadly divided into rapid eye movement sleep, during which dreaming occurs and the brain is highly active, and non-rapid eye movement sleep, which includes progressively deeper stages of unconsciousness culminating in the slow wave sleep that is most associated with physical restoration and immune function. The deepest stages of slow wave sleep, the stages during which the body does its most intensive maintenance and repair, are also the stages during which arousal is most difficult. A person in deep slow wave sleep is profoundly unresponsive to environmental stimulation. It takes a very loud noise, a very vigorous shaking to rouse them. This depth of unconsciousness, this profound vulnerability, is only adaptive in an environment where others can be trusted to remain alert. In a solitary sleeper in the ancient world, such depth of unconsciousness would be extraordinarily dangerous. But in a communal sleeper, part of a group in which other individuals are at varying stages of lighter sleep or wakefulness, deep, slow wave sleep becomes safe. The group provides the watchfulness that the individual cannot provide for themselves. The biological capacity for deep and restorative sleep is, in this sense, a social capacity. It depends on the social environment in which it evolved. Consider what this means for the modern sleeper who lies alone in a quiet room, struggling to achieve the deep and restorative sleep that our body needs. Their nervous system, shaped by millions of years of communal sleeping, is monitoring the environment for signals of social safety. In the ancient world, those signals were the breathing and warmth and occasional movements of other sleeping bodies nearby. In the modern bedroom, those signals are absent. The room is silent and still in a way that no ancient sleeping environment ever was. And the nervous system, receiving no signals of social presence, defaults to a state of somewhat heightened alertness, a state of mild watchfulness that is appropriate to a creature sleeping alone in a potentially dangerous world, but that interferes with the depth and quality of the rest that the body is seeking. This is not a flaw in the nervous system, it is the nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The flaw, if we want to use that word, is in the environment we have created. An environment that removes the social signals that the nervous system relies on to feel safe enough to rest deeply. The question of what constitutes a safe sleeping environment is one that different cultures and different historical periods have answered very differently. And the answers reveal something important about what human beings fundamentally need in order to rest. In many traditional societies, A safe sleeping environment is defined not primarily by the physical features of the space, but by the social features of it. Who is present? What is their relationship to the sleeper? How reliable are they? How trusted are they? These questions are the primary determinants of sleeping safety in a social species. The physical comfort of the sleeping surface is secondary to the social comfort of the sleeping arrangement. Modern Western culture has largely inverted this priority. We have invested enormously in the physical features of the sleeping environment, in mattresses and pillows and temperature control and darkness and quiet, while treating the social features as irrelevant to sleep quality, or even as disruptive of it. We have created elaborate technologies for improving the physical conditions of individual sleep, while progressively reducing the social context of sleep. And the epidemic of sleep difficulty that characterizes modern Western societies may reflect, at least in part, the consequences of this inversion. If we look deeper into the research on social aspect of sleep, we find some interesting data points. Studies of couples who share a bed have found that both partners tend to experience more stable and less disrupted sleep when sleeping together than when sleeping alone, despite the fact that a bed partner is a potential source of disturbance through movement and noise. The nervous system's response to the presence of a trusted partner appears to outweigh the disruption caused by that partner's physical presence in the sleep space. That sense of safety that social proximity provides seems to promote deeper and more stable sleep, even when that social proximity comes with some practical costs. Studies of infants and children have found similar patterns. Infants who sleep in close physical contact with a caregiver experience more stable respiratory patterns, more consistent heart rate regulation, and more balanced sleep architecture than infants who sleep in isolation. The caregiver's physical presence, the sound of their breathing and the warmth of their body and the subtle sensory signals of their proximity provides a kind of biological regulation that the isolated infant cannot achieve on its own. The research on this is complex and often contentious because it intersects with cultural values and safety concerns around infant sleep. But the biological evidence that infants are designed to sleep in close proximity to caregivers is substantial and consistent. The experience of aging also reveals something about the social dimensions of sleep. Older adults who live alone report significantly higher rates of sleep difficulty and insomnia than older adults who share their living space with others. The loss of a long-term partner, which often occurs in later life, is associated with significant disruption of sleep patterns in the surviving partner. These effects are not simply explained by grief or by the practical disruptions of bereavement. They reflect, at least in part, the loss of the social sleeping context that had been providing unconscious biological support for sleep over many years of shared life. From an evolutionary perspective, all of this makes deep sense. We are a social species whose biology expects to rest in the company of others. The solitary sleeping that modern Western culture treats as the norm is, from the perspective of our evolutionary history, a recent and unusual exception. And the sleep difficulties that characterize modern Western societies may in part reflect the biological costs of this exception. This does not mean that everyone should sleep in communal arrangements, or that private bedrooms are inherently harmful. Human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures, and many people do sleep well alone, particularly when they feel safe and connect to others in their waking lives. But it does mean the social dimension of sleep is real and important, and that our cultural tendency to treat sleep as a purely individual biological function, separate from social context, may be obscuring something significant about what human sleep actually is and what it actually needs. The ancient world also understood something about the relationship between sleep and storytelling that modern culture has in some ways preserved and in other ways lost. In many traditional societies, the evening hours before sleep were filled with storytelling. The elders would tell stories of the ancestors, of the animals, of the landscape, of the events of the day and the accumulated wisdom of the generations. Children would listen, and the rhythms of the spoken voice, the gentle cadences of narrative, would guide them gradually from wakefulness into sleep. The transition from listening to dreaming was sometimes so gradual as to be imperceptible. This tradition, the bedtime story as a transitional ritual between waking and sleeping, is one of the most widespread and persistent features of human culture across time and place. It appears in virtually every society that researchers have examined, and its universality suggests that it is not merely a cultural accident, but a response to something real in human psychology and biology. The human brain in the hypnagogic state, the state between waking and sleeping, is particularly receptive to narrative. The images and associations of sleep onset move with a dream-like looseness through the story material that has recently occupied the mind. A well-told story can provide a kind of narrative scaffolding for the transition into sleep, giving the mind something to follow as it moves toward rest. This is part of what documentary narration, calm and as slow and reflective, can do. It can provide a gentle voice to follow in the darkness, a voice that takes the mind somewhere slower and quieter and older than the rushing present. The content matters less, in some ways, than the quality of the voice and the pace of the telling. A voice that moves slowly, that takes time with ideas, that does not rush from point to point but allows each thought to settle before moving to the next, is a voice that the sleepy mind can follow without effort. And the mind that follows without effort is a mind that is moving toward rest. Our ancestors sat by the fire and told stories. They told stories about the animals they had seen that day, about the plants that were beginning to fruit in the valley to the east, about the ancestors who had walked this same land before them, about the spirit that lived in the river and the ghost that haunted the rocky outcropping at the edge of the territory. The children listened, and their eyes grew heavy, and the stories wove themselves into the first images of dreaming. The fire burned lower, and the darkness deepened around the sleeping group. We are sitting, in our own way, by a kind of fire. The voice that tells the story, the words that move slowly through the darkness, is a continuation of something very old. The desire to be spoken to in the night, to have the darkness made companionable by a human voice, to follow a thread of narrative into the territory of sleep, is one of the oldest desires our species has. It is older than civilization. It is older than language in its formal sense. It is the desire to not be alone in the dark, to know that another human consciousness is present and attending, to feel the community of the listening and the telling, even when the community is mediated by technology rather than expressed in the warm and immediate presence of bodies around a fire. The sleep we are moving toward in these quiet minutes or hours is the same sleep that human beings have always moved toward. The biology is unchanged. The need is unchanged. The darkness is the same darkness that has always come after the sun has set. The same quiet that has always gathered around the sleeping places of our kind. What has changed is the context, the physical and social arrangements within which we approach that darkness. But the body that lies waiting for sleep, the brain that is beginning its gradual descent through the lighter stages toward the deeper ones, the heart rate slowing and the eyes growing still and the thoughts becoming loose and associative and eventually dissolving into the landscape of dreams, this body is ancient. It has been doing this, or something very much like this, for longer than we can fully imagine. And perhaps it helps, in the quiet of the night when sleep seems distant, to remember this. To remember that the body you inhabit has done this 100,000 times before, across 100,000 generations of ancestors who lay down in the darkness and gave themselves to rest and woke again to the light. The capacity for sleep is one of the deepest and most reliable inheritances of our species. It has survived the ice ages and the migrations and agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution and all the disruptions and transformations that human history has brought. It is still there, underneath all the anxiety and the technology and the cultural noise that surrounds it. It is waiting, as it has always waited, in the quiet of the body, in the slowing of the breath, in the growing stillness of the mind. It does not need to be forced or managed or optimized. It needs to be allowed, as the ancient darkness was always allowed to come, with patience and acceptance, and the quiet trust the body needs. The body knows how to find. Sleep comes as it always has in its own time, and the night, as it always has, holds us gently in the dark. There is particular quality to the darkness that exists between the moment when the last fire dies and the first pale suggestion of morning arrives. Anyone who's spent a night in a truly wild place, far from artificial light, far from the ambient glow of cities and roads, knows this darkness in a way that most people living in the modern world do not. It is a darkness that is not merely the absence of light. It is a presence. It has texture and depth. The eyes, unable to resolve anything into shape or colour, begin to attend more carefully to sound, to temperature, to the faint movements of air, to the subtle sensory information that the other senses provide when vision is removed from the equation. In this darkness, the human nervous system does something interesting. It becomes quieter in some ways, and more attentive in others. The internal noise of visual processing fades, and in its place arises a different kind of awareness, slower and broader and more receptive. This experience of deep natural darkness was the universal nightly experience of human beings for most of our evolutionary history. Every person who lived before the invention of reliable artificial lighting spent their nights in this condition. The darkness was not frightening, at least not in the way that we might imagine it, It was familiar. It was the darkness of home, the darkness that had always come, the darkness within which the social group rested together, and the fire burned low, and the world outside the sleeping place went about its nocturnal business. Children grew up knowing this darkness. Elders had spent decades inhabiting it. The darkness of night was as familiar and as expected as the light of day, and the human nervous system had learned to inhabit it without alarm. Understanding this helps us understand something important about the nature of ancient sleep that is easy to miss. When we talk about the fragmented or biphasic nature of pre-modern sleep, when we describe the way ancient humans woke in the middle of the night and lay quietly for a time before returning to sleep, we might be tempted to imagine this waking as anxious or uncomfortable, as something that needed to be endured. But this is almost certainly wrong. The middle of the night waking in the ancient world was not anxious because the darkness was not alarming. The person who lay awake for half an hour in the middle of their sleeping group, surrounded by the warmth and breathing of others, in a darkness that was as known and as comfortable as their own skin, was not suffering from insomnia. They were simply inhabiting the night in the way that the night had always been inhabited. This distinction matters enormously when we think about the modern experience of waking in the night. And when a person living in the contemporary world wakes at 2 or 3 in the morning, they wake into a very different experiential context than their ancient ancestors did. They are alone, or nearly alone. The room is quiet in a way that feels different from the quiet of the ancient sleeping group. And crucially, they carry with them a cultural framework that tells them that waking in the night is a problem, a symptom, a failure of the sleep that they should be having. The anxiety that accompanies the waking is not a simple biological response to darkness. It is a culturally learned response to the interpretation of waking as failure. And this anxiety, this cortisol-producing, mind-activating, body-tensing response to the innocent biological event of waking in the night is what transforms a natural and ancient pattern of sleep into something that genuinely feels like insomnia. From an evolutionary perspective, we've created a kind of second-order problem. The first-order problem, if we want to call it that, is simply the fragmented nature of human sleep. The fact that our biology inclines us toward waking in the night rather than sleeping through it without interruption. This is not actually a problem at all. It is a feature of human sleep architecture that served us well for hundreds of thousands of years. The second-order problem is the anxiety we have layered on top of this natural pattern, the interpretation of night waking as pathological, the measurement and monitoring and worrying that transforms a quiet biological event into a source of genuine psychological distress. The archaeological record of human sleeping environments offers a quiet window into the ancient relationship between humans and the night. Excavations of Paleolithic sites from Africa, Europe and Asia have revealed evidence of sleeping areas within larger habitation spaces, areas that are identifiable by the concentration of hearths, by the presence of plant material that may have served as bedding, and by the patterns of artifact deposition that suggest regular nocturnal occupation. One particularly remarkable set of findings comes from a site in South Africa called Sibudu, where archaeologists discovered evidence of grass bedding dating back approximately 77,000 years. The bed appears to have been made from the leaves of a plant called river wild quince, which has natural insecticidal properties, suggesting that the ancient inhabitants of this site were not merely gathering convenient plant material, but selecting specific plants that would help keep insect away during sleep. This finding is striking because it suggests a level of intentionality and knowledge about the sleeping environment that we might not automatically associate with humans living 77,000 years ago. These were not people simply collapsing wherever they happened to be when exhaustion overtook them. They were people who thought about where and how they slept, who applied knowledge of the natural world to the problem of creating a comfortable and safe sleeping space. The plant bedding at Sibudu also appears to have been regularly replaced with fresh material, suggesting a routine of sleep space maintenance that implies a relatively settled occupation of the site, at least seasonally. Other archaeological sites have revealed similar evidence of careful attention to sleeping environments. At various Neanderthal sites in Europe and Western Asia, researchers have found evidence of prepared sleeping surfaces, sometimes incorporating the skins of large animals, and sometimes using accumulated plant material. The Neanderthals, who coexisted with modern humans for a period of time before disappearing approximately 40,000 years ago, appear to have shared with modern humans the practice of constructing dedicated sleeping spaces within larger habitation areas. This suggests that the careful preparation of a sleeping environment is not simply a feature of modern human cognition, but a deeply ancient behaviour that may predate our own species. If we look deeper into what these sleeping environments tell us about ancient life, we notice something important. The sleeping areas in ancient sites are almost always associated with hearths. The fire and the sleeping place are not separate things. They are part of the same spatial arrangement, organised together in a way that reflects the fundamental importance of the fire to the safety and warmth of the sleeping group. In many sites, the sleeping area appears to have been positioned to take maximum advantage of the Earth's heat radiated by the hearth, with the sleeping bodies arranged in an arc around the fire that balanced warmth against the risk of sparks. The spatial relationship between fire and sleeper, maintained across dozens of different archaeological sites spanning tens of thousands of years, speaks to the deep biological and psychological importance of fire to human rest. The anthropology of sleep temperature is a subject that receives relatively little attention in popular discussions of sleep science, but it is deeply relevant to understanding the ancient conditions of human sleep. The human body has a precise and carefully regulated core temperature, and the maintenance of this temperature is essential to normal physiological function. During sleep, core body temperature drops by approximately 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit from its waking level, and this drop is not incidental but is an active part of the sleep initiation process. The brain regions that govern sleep onset are closely connected to those that regulate body temperature, and the drop in core temperature that signals the beginning of sleep is one of the body's most reliable internal indicators that rest is appropriate. In the modern world, we regulate our sleeping environment temperature with thermostats and blankets and climate control systems, and most sleep experts recommend a sleeping environment temperature of somewhere between 60 and 67 degrees Fahrenheit as optimal for sleep. But in the ancient world, temperature regulation during sleep was a far more complex and uncertain matter. In tropical environments, the challenge was often heat rather than cold, and the sleeping arrangements of hunter-gatherers in these regions reflect strategies for managing warmth, including sleeping in elevated positions to catch breezes, sleeping near water for the cooling effect of evaporation, and adjusting the density of the sleeping group based on the ambient temperature. In more temperate and subarctic environments, cold was the primary challenge, and the sleeping arrangements of populations in these regions reflect elaborate strategies for conserving body heat, from the dense group sleeping of Arctic peoples to the careful construction of insulated sleeping spaces in early northern settlements. The diversity of these temperature management strategies across different human populations tells us something important about the adaptability of human sleep. Human beings have slept in environments ranging from the equatorial rainforest to the Arctic tundra, and they have found ways to sleep in all of these environments, adapting their sleeping arrangements, their sleeping positions, their social organization of sleep, and their material culture around sleep to meet the thermal challenges of each environment. This adaptability is itself a remarkable feature of our species, a testament to the cognitive flexibility and social coordination that have allowed humans to inhabit more diverse environments than any other large mammal on Earth. The seasonal variation of sleep in high-altitude environments is particularly interesting from an evolutionary perspective. In the Arctic and subarctic regions that humans have inhabited for at least 30,000 years, The variation in day length between summer and winter is extreme. At high latitudes, summer days can be nearly endless, with the sun barely dipping below the horizon for weeks at a time, while winter brings months of near total darkness. The human circadian system, sensitive as it is to light, responds to these extremes in ways that produce very different sleep patterns across the seasons. In summer, the persistent light suppresses melatonin and delays sleep onset, and people in traditional Arctic communities historically slept less, and in more fragmented patterns during the bright summer months. In winter, the extended darkness promotes longer and more consolidated sleep, and traditional Arctic peoples often slept for extended periods during the dark months, with the long winter nights providing an abundance of sleep opportunity that the body was willing to take. This seasonal variation in sleep duration and pattern is largely absent from the lives of people in modern, industrialized societies, where artificial lighting and fixed work schedules impose a year-round uniformity on sleep that has no parallel in our evolutionary history. The body's natural inclination toward more sleep in winter and less in summer is suppressed by the artificial extension of daylight through electric lighting. And the potential benefits of this seasonal variation, including the possible role of extended winter sleep in metabolic restoration, immune function, and psychological integration, are largely foregone in the service of a calendar that does not acknowledge the seasons. There is a concept in chronobiology called social jet lag, which refers to the mismatch between an individual's internal biological clock and the clock time that their social and work obligations require them to follow. Most people in modern societies experience some degree of social jet lag because the standardized schedules of work and school are set according to social convention rather than biological timing. A person whose natural sleep period runs from midnight to 8 in the morning will experience social jet lag every workday when they are required to wake at 6. The accumulated sleep debt and circadian disruption that result from this mismatch are associated with a range of health consequences, including increased risk of metabolic disorders, cardiovascular disease, mood disorders, and cognitive impairment. From an evolutionary perspective, social jet lag is a product of the same forces that have produced the modern sleep crisis more broadly. The imposition of standardized time on human biological rhythms is a very recent historical development, dating essentially from the Industrial Revolution and the widespread adoption of mechanical clocks and standardized time zones. Before this imposition, people set their daily rhythms by the sun, and by the natural variation of light through the day and through the seasons. They rose when it was light enough to work and slept when darkness and fatigue made continued activity unprofitable. The variation in individual chronotypes, which we now experience as a source of social conflict and personal inconvenience, was simply part of the natural diversity of a human community, and the community accommodated this diversity without the rigid scheduling that modern life imposes. The question of chronotype, the question of whether an individual is naturally inclined toward earlier or later sleeping, is one that has received considerable attention from sleep researchers in the recent decades. The evidence strongly suggests that chronotype has a substantial genetic component, meaning that the tendency toward morning or evening orientation is not simply a matter of habit or preference, but reflects real differences in the biological timing systems of different individuals. A minority of the population are extreme morning types, rising naturally at or before dawn, and becoming sleepy in the early evening. A similar minority are extreme evening types, unable to fall asleep until late at night, and naturally waking in the late morning if given the opportunity. The majority fall somewhere between these extremes, with a range of intermediate chronotypes. The distribution of chronotypes in a population has an interesting implication for the group sleeping of ancient human communities. If a group of 20 to 40 individuals contains people with a range of chronotypes, some naturally early and some naturally late, then the group as a whole will have a more extended period of collective alertness around the edges of the sleeping period, with early types already awake and active before the late types have finished sleeping, and late types still awake and alert while the early types were already beginning to drowse. This extension of the group's collective active period through chronotype diversity is another example of how what appears to be individual variation serves a group-level function. The diversity of chronotypes is not a biological accident. It is a feature of human population biology that enhances the group's ability to maintain surveillance and social function across a longer daily period. The anthropological literature on contemporary hunter-gatherer communities offers some remarkable observations about the social life that surrounds sleep. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, whom we mentioned earlier, the period around dusk is one of the most socially rich times of the day. As the light fades and the temperature drops, people gather near fires. The quality of social interaction shifts from the practical and task-oriented activity of the day towards something quieter and more reflective. Stories are told, disputes are discussed and sometimes resolved. The events of the day are shared and processed. The social fabric of the group is maintained and strengthened in these quiet evening hours in ways that are important to the cohesion of the community. This evening's social period is not merely a pleasant addition to the day. It serves functions that are genuinely important to the well-being of the group and of individuals within it. The processing of the day's events in a social context, the sharing of experiences and the communal interpretation of what has happened, is a form of collective emotional regulation that helps individuals manage the stresses and anxieties of daily life. The storytelling that often accompanies these evening gatherings serves to transmit knowledge across generations, to reinforce the values and norms of the group, and to create the shared narrative frameworks through which individuals understand themselves and their place in the world. And the gradual winding down of social intensity as the evening progresses and people begin to move towards sleep creates a gentle transition from the engagement of the day to the rest of the night. Modern life has largely dismantled the evening social transition. The working day ends, often abruptly, and the hours between work and sleep are frequently filled with the consuming but not socially integrative activity of screen engagement. The quiet, communal processing of the day's events that the evening fire once provided has been replaced by individual consumption of content that is designed to engage and stimulate, rather than to quiet and to integrate. And then we lie down in our separate rooms and wonder why the mind continues to race with unprocessed thoughts and unresolved anxieties that the ancient evening ritual of communal fire and storytelling might have gently dissolved. The biology of the transition from waking to sleeping is itself a fascinating and underappreciated subject. The hypnagogic state, the state between full wakefulness and sleep onset, is a neurologically distinct condition that has some remarkable properties. In this state, the brain is neither fully engaged in the directed cognitive processing of waking, nor fully disengaged in the restorative processing of sleep. It occupies a kind of threshold space in which the barriers between different kinds of mental content become more permeable. The imagery that arises in the hypnagogic state is often vivid and unexpected, drawing on recent experiences and deeper memories and combinations that the fully waking mind would not generate. sounds and sensations can take on unusual vividness. The sense of the body's boundaries can become uncertain. Many people who have paid attention to this transitional state report that it has a particular quality of receptiveness and creativity. Some of the most celebrated creative insights in the history of science and art have reportedly occurred in hypnagogic states, when the relaxed and associative processing of the transitional mind made connections that the directed processing of waking cognition had missed. Thomas Edison, according to some accounts, used to nap in a chair holding steel balls in his hands, so that when he drifted into sleep and his hands relaxed, the falling balls would wake him and he could capture the hypnagogic imagery before it dissolved into full sleep. Whether or not this particular story is literally true, it reflects a genuine understanding of the creative potential of the sleep threshold state. In the ancient world, this threshold state between waking and sleeping was understood in many cultures as a particularly significant and potentially meaningful experience. The images and impressions of the hypnagogic state were not distinguished, in many pre-scientific frameworks, from dream experiences, and both were understood as potentially informative communications from dimensions of reality that were not accessible to ordinary waking consciousness. The careful attention that many ancient cultures paid to the experiences of the sleep threshold, the ritual preparation for sleep, the intention setting before lying down, the careful recollection and interpretation of what arose in the mind at sleep onset, all reflected a genuine intuition that something important happened in this transitional space. From a neuroscientific perspective, we can say something interesting about why this intuition might have substance. The hypnagogic state is associated with a shift in dominant brainwave frequency from the beta waves of active waking cognition toward the alpha waves of relaxed wakefulness, and then toward the theta waves that characterize the earlier stages of sleep. The theta state is associated with increased connectivity between different brain regions, with loosened inhibitory control over the associations between different kinds of mental content, and with heightened activation of memory consolidation processes. The experiences of the hypnagogic state are in part a reflection of the brain's activity as it begins the memory consolidation work of sleep, drawing on the day's experiences and connecting them to longer-term memories and knowledge structures. The imagery that arises is not random noise. It is a glimpse of the brain's associative processing, of the connections it is making and the patterns it is finding in the material of waking experience. Understanding this helps us understand something about the function of the quiet evening period that precedes sleep in ancient and traditional communities. When people gather by the fire in evening and share the stories of the day, when the conversations wind down and the voices grow quieter and the minds begin to drift, this gradual transition prepares the brain for the memory consolidation work of sleep in a way that abrupt transitions do not. The material that has been socially processed in the evening conversation, the events that have been named and narrated and given meaning in the communal context of the evening fire, is material that the brain can more readily integrate into its long-term memory structures. The sleep that follows a well-prepared evening transition may be, in a genuine neurological sense, more restorative and more integrative than the sleep that follows an abrupt shift from screen stimulation to forced darkness. The relationship between the gut microbiome and sleep is a relatively recent discovery that opens a new dimension of understanding about the ancient conditions of human rest. The human gut contains approximately 38 trillion bacteria, a population of microorganisms so vast that it rivals the number of human cells in the body. This microbial community is intimately connected to the human nervous system through what researchers call the gut-brain axis, a bidirectional communication network that includes neural, hormonal, and immunological pathways. The gut microbiome influences the production of neurotransmitters, including serotonin, of which approximately 90% is produced in the gut, and it influences the inflammatory signaling that plays a role in sleep regulation. But what is interesting from the perspective of ancient sleep is that the gut microbiome of ancient hunter-gatherers was almost certainly very different from the gut microbiome of people living in modern industrialized societies. The hunter-gatherer diet was vastly more diverse than the typical modern diet, including a wide range of plant foods, insect, fermented materials, and various animal products that supported a highly diverse microbial community. Modern industrial diets, by contrast, tend to support a less diverse microbiome, and this reduction in microbial diversity is associated with various health consequences, including changes in sleep quality and sleep architecture. Studies comparing the gut microbiomes of contemporary hunter-gatherer populations with those of Western populations have found dramatic differences in microbial diversity, and these differences are associated with differences in a range of health outcomes, including sleep-related ones. This connection between gut microbiome diversity and sleep quality is another dimension of the mismatch between our ancient biology and our modern environment. The human body's sleep regulatory systems evolved in the context of a gut microbiome shaped by a very different diet, and the changes in diet and microbiome composition that have accompanied industrialization may be contributing to sleep difficulties in ways that are not immediately obvious. The simple act of eating a more diverse range of plant foods, which support a more diverse gut microbiome, may have modest but real benefits for sleep quality that operate through these gut-brain pathways, the physical environment of ancient sleeping, the specific sensory qualities of the surfaces and surroundings in which our ancestors rested, is another dimension of ancient sleep that modern life has transformed in ways that may have unrecognized consequences. Our ancestors slept on the ground, on plant material, on animal skins, on natural surfaces that were irregular and variable in their texture and firmness. The surface beneath them was never perfectly flat, never perfectly uniform, never engineered to distribute pressure evenly across the body. This variability in the sleeping surface meant that the sleeper was required to shift position regularly through the night to find comfortable arrangements within the constraints of an imperfect surface. This regular repositioning during sleep may have served physiological functions beyond mere comfort. The lymphatic system, which plays a crucial role in immune function and tissue maintenance, is dependent on body movement for its circulation. Unlike the cardiovascular system, which has the heart to drive its circulation, the lymphatic system relies on the mechanical compression of lymphatic vessels by surrounding muscles and tissues. During the active movement of waking life, this compression is provided by ordinary muscular activity. During sleep, the regular repositioning of the body provides some of the movement needed to maintain lymphatic circulation. The perfectly engineered modern mattress, by reducing the discomfort that prompts sleep repositioning, may in a subtle way be reducing the mechanical stimulation of the lymphatic system that ancient sleep on irregular surfaces provided. This is not an argument against comfortable mattresses. The reduction of pressure point discomfort and the improvement in spinal alignment that good sleeping surfaces provide are real benefits. But it is an example of the kind of unintended consequence that can arise when we engineer our physical environment away from the conditions in which our biology evolved, optimizing for one variable, comfort, at the potential cost of others that are less immediately obvious. The acoustic environment of ancient sleep was also very different from the acoustic environment of modern sleep. Our ancestors slept not in silence, but in the midst of the sounds of the natural world. Crickets and frogs and nightjars and owls contributed to the acoustic landscape of the night. Wind moved through trees and grasses. Water ran over stones. These natural sounds were the acoustic backdrop against which the human auditory system evolved, and there is evidence that the sleeping brain processes these sounds differently from the silence that modern sleep ideals prescribe. The auditory cortex remains active during sleep, continuing to monitor the acoustic environment for signals of significance. In a natural acoustic environment, this monitoring is productive, allowing the sleeper to distinguish between the familiar background sounds of the night and the anomalous sounds that might signal threat or opportunity. In the artificial silence of a modern bedroom, this monitoring can become a source of heightened sensitivity to every small sound, every creak of the building and distant car and neighbour's movement, because the baseline of expected sound against which anomalies are measured has been removed. The white noise machines and sound masking technologies that many people now use to help them sleep are, in a sense, attempts to recreate the acoustic richness of the natural sleeping environment, to provide a consistent sound backdrop against which the auditory system can relax its vigilant monitoring. The sounds most commonly used for this purpose, rain, ocean waves, wind through trees, running water, are precisely the sounds of the natural acoustic environment in which human sleep evolved. The fact that these sounds are effective for many people in promoting sleep onset and maintenance is consistent with the idea that the human auditory system has a deeply embedded expectation of hearing them during rest. Movement during sleep is another dimension of ancient sleeping that modern sleep culture has complicated in interesting ways. The ideal of perfectly still sleep, of lying in one position throughout the night without movement, is a modern one that has no parallel in ancient or traditional sleeping arrangements. Ancient humans sleeping on imperfect surfaces in communal groups moved regularly during the night, shifting positions in response to discomfort, adjusting their arrangements in relation to the fire and to each other, occasionally rising to tend to the fire or to respond to sounds from outside the sleeping area. This movement was not considered disruptive. It was simply part of what sleeping in a living environment looked like. The modern sleeping partner who moves frequently during the night, who shifts positions and rolls over and adjusts their position in relation to the blankets and the other sleeper, is doing something that is biologically normal and historically unremarkable. Yet modern sleep culture often frames sleep movement as a problem, particularly when it disturbs a partner. The products designed to minimize sleep disturbance between partners, the specially engineered mattresses that absorb motion and the separate blanket systems that prevent one person's movements from affecting another, reflect a cultural ideal of perfectly isolated individual sleep that is at odds with the ancient reality of communal, movement-filled rest. There's something worth pausing on in the observation that so many of the technologies and cultural practices that modern societies have developed around sleep are oriented toward isolation and stillness. We isolate the sleeper in a private room. We provide a surface engineered to minimize movement disturbance. We use earplugs and eye masks and blackout curtains to reduce sensory input. We take medications that suppress arousal and promote unconsciousness. All of these interventions are attempts to create the conditions for what we imagine ideal sleep to look like. a single consolidated block of uninterrupted unconsciousness in perfect sensory isolation. And yet this imagined ideal has no historical or evolutionary precedent. It is an invention, a cultural construct that emerged from the specific conditions of industrialized modernity, and that bears very little relationship to the conditions in which human sleep actually evolved. The paradox is that in pursuing this invented ideal, we may be undermining the very biological systems that support the kind of sleep we are trying to achieve. By isolating ourselves from the social signals that tell the nervous system it is safe to rest deeply, by removing the natural acoustic and sensory environment that the auditory and sensory systems expect during sleep, by suppressing with medication their natural arousal rhythms that represent the body's own sleep architecture, we may be creating conditions that work against, rather than with, the biology of human rest. This is not a counsel of despair. It is an invitation to curiosity. The history of human sleep, the long and varied and deeply social history that we have been exploring, is not primarily a story of what we have lost. It is a story of what we are. It is a story about the kind of creature the human being is, about the social and biological and environmental needs that define our species, about the deep continuity between the ancient human body and the modern one. The person lying awake in the quiet hours of a contemporary night is not essentially different biologically from the person who lay awake in the quiet hours of a Paleolithic night 50,000 years ago. The same melatonin is rising and falling. The same cortisol is responding to the signals of the environment. The same social brain is monitoring for signs of safety and threat. The same memory consolidation is processing the experiences of the recent past. The biology has not changed. Only the environment has. And if the environment has changed, then perhaps the most useful thing we can do is understand, as clearly as possible, the mismatch between the environment we've created and the biology we carry. Not to return to the Paleolithic, which is neither possible nor desirable, but to make small adjustments where we can toward conditions that are more congruent with our evolutionary inheritance, to dim the lights in the evening rather than maintaining the brightness of artificial day until the moment we expect sleep to arrive. To move toward the sleeping space with some degree of intention and ritual, honouring the transition that the body is making, to be gentle with ourselves when we wake in the night, remembering that this waking is ancient and normal and not a failure, to consider, where possible, whether the conditions of our sleep might be more socially embedded, whether the presence of others might support rather than undermine our rest. There is also something to be said for the simple act of understanding, for the quiet and somewhat humbling recognition of how ancient we are. The human body carries within it the accumulated wisdom of an unimaginably long evolutionary history, a history in which the challenges of surviving and reproducing in a complex and often dangerous world shaped every aspect of our biology, including the biology of sleep. This accumulated wisdom is not infallible, and it is not always well adapted to the conditions of modern life. But it is genuinely wise, in the sense that it represents the tested solutions to real problems that countless generations of our ancestors faced and solved. And the fragmented sleep that so many modern people experience as a disorder may be, in part, the body's ancient wisdom asserting itself against the conditions of environment that its architecture was not designed for. To understand this is not to excuse poor sleep or to discourage the pursuit of better rest. It is to bring a different quality of attention to the experience of sleep and to the conditions that surround it. It is to ask not just how can I sleep better, but what does my body actually need, and what kind of environment would genuinely support the sleep that my ancient biology is seeking. These are questions that modern sleep science can help answer, and so can anthropology, and so can the long and quietly remarkable history of human beings lying down, together in the darkness and trusting the night to hold them. The river of human sleep runs very deep. It began before our species began, in the sleeping arrangements of our primate ancestors in their forest nests, in the evolutionary pressures that shaped the architecture of primate rest across millions of years of biological history. It deepened and changed as our lineage diverged from other primates, as we descended from the trees and learned to sleep on the ground, as we discovered fire and its power to make the night less dangerous, as we developed the extraordinary social complexity that allowed large groups of our kind to sleep together in conditions of mutual trust and collective vigilance. It flowed through the migrations that carried our ancestors out of Africa and across the world, through these climatic challenges of ice ages and the warmth of interglacial periods, through the transition to agriculture and the rise of cities and the revolutions in technology that have transformed human life with accelerating speed over the past several thousand years. And it flows still through every person who lies down tonight in whatever arrangement and whatever context their life has produced, carrying in their cells and their nervous systems and their hormonal rhythms the deep imprint of that long history. The sleep that comes is not merely the shutting down of a biological machine. It is the continuation of one of the oldest and most essential activities of our species, the daily return to the restorative darkness, the release of the waking self into the ancient and still mysterious country of rest. Whatever difficulties attend the journey into that country, whatever anxieties and wakings and imperfect restings the night may bring, the capacity for sleep is one of the most durable gifts of our evolutionary inheritance. It has carried us this far. It will carry us further still. And in the quiet of whatever night you inhabit, however imperfect its conditions, however far it falls from the ancient ideal of the communal fire and the sleeping group and the star-filled sky, the same darkness waits that has always waited. The same body lies ready, the same deep biological pull toward rest shaped by an unimaginable depth of evolutionary time draws the waking mind gently, persistently toward the threshold. There's nothing required of you now but to follow. The breath slows. The thoughts grow loose and then looser still. The sounds of the present fade towards something older and quieter. And somewhere in the long, patient dark of the ancient sleeper that you are finds, as it has always found, the rest it was made for. The neuroscience of slow-wave sleep, the deepest and most physically restorative stage of human rest, offers a remarkable window into the biological functions that sleep evolved to serve. During slow-wave sleep, the brain undergoes a dramatic shift in its electrical activity, moving from the relatively fast and desynchronized waves of waking cognition to the large, synchronized slow waves that give this stage its name. These slow waves represent the coordinated firing of large populations of neurons in a rhythm that sweeps across the cortex in regular pulses. And during these pulses, something extraordinary happens in the brain's fluid dynamics that researchers have only recently begun to understand. The glymphatic system, a network of fluid channels that surrounds the brain's blood vessels, expands dramatically during slow-wave sleep, increasing the flow of cerebrospinal fluid through the brain's tissue. This enhanced fluid flow serves as a kind of biological cleaning system, flushing out the metabolic waste products that accumulate in brain tissue during waking activity. Among the substances cleared by this glymphatic flushing is amyloid beta, a protein whose accumulation in the brain is associated with Alzheimer's disease. The discovery that slow-wave sleep plays a central role in clearing amyloid beta from the brain has important implications for our understanding of the relationship between sleep and the long-term health of the aging brain. From an evolutionary perspective, this glymphatic clearing function helps explain why sleep is so profoundly necessary and why the biological drive towards sleep is so powerful. The brain is the most metabolically active organ in the body, consuming a disproportionate share of the body's energy relative to its size, and the waste products of this intense metabolic activity accumulate during waking hours and must be cleared during sleep. An organism that did not sleep, or that slept too little, would gradually accumulate metabolic waste in its brain tissue, with progressively impaired cognitive function. The evolutionary pressure toward adequate sleep is thus rooted in part in the neurochemical reality of brain maintenance, in the daily necessity of clearing the metabolic debris of waking life. What is interesting about this biological function in the context of our discussion of ancient sleep is that it helps explain something that has sometimes puzzled researchers about the sleep of hunter-gatherer populations. Despite the fact that people in traditional hunter-gatherer societies sleep for somewhat shorter durations on average than sleep medicine recommendations suggest is optimal, and despite the fact that their sleep is more fragmented and less consolidated than the ideal that modern sleep science describes, they do not appear to suffer the cognitive and health consequences that the same sleep pattern in a modern context would be expected to produce. Their slow-wave sleep, the physically restorative stage that serves the glymphatic clearing function, appears to be preserved even when total sleep duration is reduced or when sleep is fragmented. The biological architecture of sleep, shaped by millions of years of evolution, prioritizes the most essential restorative functions even under conditions that fall short of the theoretical optimum. This prioritization of essential sleep functions over total sleep duration tells us something important. The human body is not a machine that requires exactly 8 hours of operation in a specific configuration in order to function properly. It is a biological system with considerable flexibility and considerable capacity for optimization under varying conditions. The sleep that hunter-gatherers get, though shorter and more fragmented than the modern ideal, meets their biological needs because their bodies are functioning in the environmental context for which they were designed, a context which the social and sensory signals of the sleeping environment support the nervous system's capacity to achieve deep and restorative rest, even within a shorter or more interrupted sleep period. The modern person who struggles to feel rested despite adequate hours of sleep may be experiencing the consequence of a sleeping environment that fails to provide those supporting signals, a context in which the body cannot achieve the same depth of restoration in the same amount of time because the conditions that support deep rest are absent. The philosophy of sleep in traditional cultures often reflects a more integrated understanding of rest than modern Western culture provides. In many indigenous traditions, sleep is understood not as a passive absence of consciousness, but as an active engagement with a different dimension of reality. The sleeping person is not simply offline, they are elsewhere, in a territory that has its own geography and its own significance, a territory that the waking world can learn from if the dreamer pays careful attention upon return. This orientation towards sleep as meaningful experience, as a form of activity rather than mere cessation of activity, creates a very different relationship with the night than the one that most modern people inhabit. The Iroquois of northeastern North America, for example, maintained an elaborate cultural framework around dreams that held that dreams express the deepest desires of the soul, and that failure to honour these desires, failure to act on the guidance of dream experience, could lead to illness and misfortune. The community as a whole took responsibility for helping individuals understand and act on significant dreams, and the interpretation of dreams was a communal activity that reinforced the social bonds of the group while also serving the psychological needs of individuals. This cultural valuation of dream experience created conditions in which people approached sleep with intention and attention, treating the night as a meaningful part of life rather than as a void between days. The psychological benefits of this orientation are not trivial. A person who approaches sleep with the expectation that it will bring meaningful experience, who lies down with the sense of anticipation rather than anxiety, who treats the night as a time of genuine activity rather than enforced unconsciousness, is a person whose relationship with sleep is likely to be easier and more fulfilling than one who approaches the night primarily with anxiety of performance, with the worry that they may not sleep well enough or long enough or deeply enough. The cultural framework around sleep shapes the psychological experience of sleep in ways that have real effects on sleep quality. And the framework that modern Western culture provides is in many ways poorly suited to supporting the biological experience of rest. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the long history of human sleep. The experience of rest is not purely biological. It is always also cultural, always also shaped by the meanings and expectations and social contexts that surround it. The biology sets the parameters, defines the needs, creates the architecture, but the culture fills in the content, shapes the experience, determines what the night feels like and what relationship we have with it. And across the vast sweep of human history, the cultures that have surrounded sleep with the richest and most supportive frameworks have been those that understood sleep as communal, as meaningful, as connected to the natural world, as worthy of intention and attention. The cultures that have produced the most sleep difficulty, the greatest anxiety about rest, the most widespread experience of insomnia and fatigue, have been those that have treated sleep as an individual performance, a biological function to be optimized in isolation from the social and natural world. We are, in this sense, not victims of our biology. We are in part victims of our cultural frameworks, and cultural frameworks, unlike biological evolution, can change within a single generation. The understanding that a fragmented night's sleep is not a disorder, that waking in the darkness is ancient and natural, that the need for social proximity during rest is a genuine biological need and not a weakness, that the transition into sleep deserves attention and intention, and perhaps even a kind of reverence. These understandings are available to anyone who reaches for them. They do not require a return to the Paleolithic. They require only a willingness to look at the long history of our species with open eyes, and to let that history inform the way we inhabit the 1/3 of our lives that we spend in rest. The night is very old, the body that inhabits it is very old, and the sleep that comes, in whatever form it comes, is the continuation of something that began long before any of us, in the ancient dark of a world that was just learning what it meant to be human.